Hello and welcome back to Him Reads as we continue with The Bad Seed. 3. Mrs. Breedlove lived with her brother on the floor above the pen marks. There had been a great event in her life on which she had not been able to forget. In the middle 20s, her husband, not knowing what else to do with her, exceeded her wish that she go to Vienna and be psychoanalyzed by Professor Freud. The story of her analysis was one which she never tired of telling, one whose possibilities she never succeeded in exhausting. It seems that after her intense initial session with the professor, he had said frankly that her particular temperament was beyond his skill and suggested that she go to London and seek the aid of his pupil, Dr. Aaron Kettlebaum. This she had done. It was a fortunate suggestion, she often said, not that I'm minimizing Dr. Freud's standing in any matter, shape, or form, for I'm still considering him in spite of his particularities the greatest genius of our time, but Dr. Kettlebaum was more simpatico, if you know what I mean. Freud was so committed to the 19th century materialism that it warped his viewpoint, it seemed to me. Then, he too loathed American women, particularly the ones who were able to stand on their own feet and slug it out on equal terms with men. Now, Dr. Kettlebaum believed in the power of the individual soul, and he considered sex of only trivial interest. His mind was mystic rather than literal, the same as my own. He did much for me, and when he died several years ago, I gave flowers and cried for a week. She had returned to her husband 3 years later, and at once began proceedings for a divorce, an action which he made no effort to oppose. When she was free again, she decided it was her duty to make a home for her brother, Emery, and she did so. She took pleasure in the analysis of his character, analysis that he endured mostly in silence. Of late, she had come to the conclusion that, through a series of her own deductions, that Emery was, as she termed it, a larvated homosexual, and once during the preceding spring, at one of her dinner parties, she seized on the new theme and discussed it so freely that the only unembarrassed person at the table was herself. "What does larvated mean?" asked Emery. "That one I haven't heard so far." "It means concealed, as with a mask," said Mrs. Breedlove. It means covered, as with a mask," said Mrs. Breedlove. "It means concealed." "It means something that hasn't come to the surface as yet," said Kenneth Penmark. "You can say that again," said Emery, laughing weakly. He was a plump, ruddy man, a few years younger than his sister. His hair had receded far back on his pink domed forehead. His belly was small and hard. It had taut, rounded quality as though designed by nature as a background for the watch and chain emblem. Frank Billings, whom Monica always referred to as Emery's canasta friend, said, "Well, where did you get the idea, Monica? What makes you think that?" "My opinion," said Mrs. Breedlove, "is based on the evidence of pure association, and that's the best evidence of all." She sipped her wine, puffed her lips thoughtfully, and went on with earnest voice. "To begin with, Emery is 52 years old, and he's never married. I doubt if he's ever had a serious love affair." Then, seeing that I was about to be interrupted by Reginald Tasker, one of Emery's true murder mystery friends, she raised her hand and said, "Please, please," in a placating voice, and then went on quickly. "Now let's look at things objectively. What are Emery's deepest interests in life? What are things that can occupy his psyche? There are fishing, murder mysteries that involve the dismemberment of faithful housewives, canasta, baseball games, and singing male quartets." She paused and then said, "How does Emery spend his Sundays?" "He spends them on a boat with other men, fishing. And are there ladies on such occasions?" "I can answer that question at once. There are not." "You're damn right there are not," said Emery. Mrs. Breedlove looked about her, and then realized for the first time the effect she created among her guests. She tossed her head and said in a surprised voice, "I don't see why the idea shocks you so. A thing so commonplace as that. Actually, homosexuality is triter than incest." Dr. Kettlebaum considers a matter of personal preference, but it would be a mistake to think of this obsessed, garrulous old woman as a fool in most matters. She had taken the lump settlement that her husband had so cheerfully given her and invested in real estate, following a system based on both sexual symbolism and the altered fact if the town continued to grow as everyone predicted. It had to go in the direction of her holdings. She had been so successful from the first. She had written a successful cookbook. She was responsible for the city's psychiatric clinic. She thought of this as a tireless civic worker, a logical, efficient chairman of the charitable drive for funds. On the day of the school picnic, Mrs. Breedlove telephoned Christine and had asked her for lunch. One of Emery's fishing friends had sent him a beautiful 7-pound redfish. Emery himself had called to say just that. Since it was Saturday, he was closing the plant at noon and would be home for lunch. He asked her to fix red gelpy, which she hadn't done in a long time, and she said she would. Emery's inviting his friend Reggie Tasker, that true crime writer you and Kenneth met last spring in our apartment, and he wants you to help entertain him. Now, why don't you come up early, say around noon? I'll show you how to fix the redfish. It's in the sauce, mostly. Later, Mrs. Breedlove decided to serve her lunch not in her gloomy paneled dining room, but in the little alcove off her living room where she kept her little ferns and African violets. And when her brother and his guest arrived, the table was set there and ready. The men were talking about a recent murder, one which was being featured in the local papers. Reginald Tasker, it appeared, was going to do one for one of his murder magazines, and I was gathering his preliminary facts. Miss Breedlove, hearing fragments of the toss, laughed and tossed her head and said, "We're off to the races again." The case concerned a middle-aged hospital nurse, a Mrs. Dennison, who had been indicted for murder on May 4th of her heavily insured 2-year-old niece, Shirley. It was the 10 remember that another niece, a sister of the 1952 victim, had died in 1950 in the same manner when she had been 2 years old as well. Nurse Dennison, a woman dedicated to the benefits of insurance, had collected $5,000 on the death of the first child. The second niece she insured for $6,000. Mrs. Breedlove came into the living room to welcome her visitor. Christine followed immediately and put a picture of martinis on the coffee table. A moment later, they went to the alcove for a final checkup of the luncheon table, and Reggie went on quickly to say that Nurse Dennison's husband, conventionally true to the family tradition of nausea, burning throat, and convulsions, had passed on in the autumn of 1951, with, of course, the conventional policies on his life. Christine laughed a little, put her hands on her ears, and said so softly that men could not hear her that she did not like to listen to such stories. Anything concerning crime, particularly murder, depressed her or made her anxious. She had seen the accounts of the Dennison case, but she could not bring herself to read them. She had merely turned the page and had gone on to do something more cheerful. "You have a little psychic block there," said Mrs. Breedlove in an intense, pleased whisper. "Now, if you'll associate to the situation, get to the root of your anxiety." She straightened her centerpiece, and when Christine did not answer at once, she said earnestly, "Tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. Tell me, no matter how silly it seems to you." Reginald Tasker went on to say that in the forenoon of May 1st of that year, Nurse Dennison had visited her sister-in-law's family. She got there in time for lunch. At once she picked up her niece Shirley and began playing with the child. She meant to bring Shirley a present, she said, but forgotten, a thing which distressed her so greatly she went to the country store nearby and bought candy and soda pop for the family. "Nothing comes into my mind," said Christine. "It's entirely blank." "Actually, Nurse Dennison had brought her niece a present," said Reginald Tasker. "It was 10 cents worth of arsenic she bought on her way to her sister-in-law's home. In a way, it was more of a present for herself than for her niece, since she stood to benefit so greatly if she succeeded in administering it." "But what's on your mind at the moment?" insisted Mrs. Breedlove. They returned to the kitchen as Mrs. Breedlove agitated the salad in a big wooden bowl. Christine said presently, "I was thinking how much the Fern sisters are impressed by my father's reputation. Miss Burgess thinks I look very much like him, although she never saw him in person, as familiar only with his photographs." Mrs. Breedlove said in an uncertain voice, "That's an unusual association, I must say. I don't understand it so far." She narrowed her eyes, pursed her lips, and listened absently to the conversation in the living room. According to Richard Tasker's notes, Nurse Dennison returned with her treat and immediately prepared a drink of orange pop for her niece Shirley. For the next hour or so, she observed the child's convulsions with the most flattering concern. Later on, perhaps the child's stamina seemed about to triumph over her aunt's intentions. Nurse Dennison said that, in her opinion, what little Shirley needed at this point in her illness was another sip or two of orange pop. It was sure to settle her stomach and return to her customary bouncing hell. She tendered the cup, and Shirley, a sweet, obedient child, drank at her aunt's bidding. "Now, what's your second association?" insisted Mrs. Breedlove. Maybe your second association will be clear." "It's even sillier," said Christine. For a moment she turned her past over in her mind and impulsively said, "I've always had a feeling I was an adopted child, and that Bravos weren't my real parents. I asked my mother about it once. It was in Chicago, the year I finished high school, but she kept saying, 'Who have you been talking to? Who's been putting such ideas in your head?' The thing upset her so much I never mentioned it ever again." "Oh, you poor innocent darling," said Monica. "Don't you know that a changeling fantasy is one of the most commonest of childhood? I once believed I was a foundling with royal blood. Plantagenet, I think it was. I don't know how I managed to get on my parents' doorstep, but I worked out well enough when I was 5 years old. The myths and folklore of all the people seemed simply teemed with such fantasies." Her laughter died suddenly. In the silence, Reginald Tasker's voice came through once more. After the child accepted her second dose of arsenic, and it was plain she could not rally again, Nurse Dennison announced she must hurry back to town in order to take care of a matter of her own. This errand, as it turned out, was a trip to the agent from whom she bought her smaller of the two policies she carried on the life of her niece. She failed to pay the current minimum, and this particular day was her last day of grace. She paid the premium in time and ate her supper on the knowledge that a good piece of business had been accomplished that day. She was certain the child could not last till midnight, and in this she was correct, for the little girl died about 8, making both policies operative. Mrs. Breedlove, who had been listening, nodding her head from time to time, said in her opinion, Reginald Tasker wasn't all bad in his specialty. It was true that she ranked him miles below an inspired psychologist like Dr. Wortham. She did not even consider him on par with men like Bolitho and Rougehead, but there was a quality of compassion, of irony in his best work that distinguished him, that made him stand out in his field. Then, their preparations for lunch completed, Mrs. Breedlove and Christine joined the men in the living room. They each took a cocktail, and Monica, her confident ankles crossed firmly, said, "Can't you find something else to talk about?" "When she says something else, she means sex," said Emery. He turned to Christine, as though seeking support, which only smiled and lowered her eyes, her thoughts turning once more to the past. They were unfocused, shapeless things which had troubled her childhood. Even when she had been happiness, there was a half-memory of some dreadful event, which she never understood, even at the time of the occurrence. But there were things so formless and far away that existed in her mind, less as certainly than a feeling of unreasoning dread. She sighed, pressed back her hair, and thought, "I think I once lived on a farm somewhere, and I think I had brothers and sisters to play with." Monica thrust her jaw forward, and in a quick, spasmodic movement, she jerked her head forward as though there was a pebble to balance on her chin, and she strove to toss it over her shoulder. "My tic is annoying today," she said. "I don't know why, I'm sure." She lit a cigarette and went on. "I talked to Dr. Kettlebaum about my tic and how to overcome it. But he looked at me in surprise and said, dear lady, it's such a young, such an intriguing gesture. Why not leave it the way it is?" "That Kettlebaum must have been quite a boy," said Emery. Monica agreed placidly. Dr. Kettlebaum had been wise and a most useful man. She said, her brown eyes swimming with light. Certainly he would have instantly understood that her brother's and Reginald's attempts to transform their conscious violence into something more acceptable to society. An odd thing was that neither of them had become a surgeon, which would have been far more dramatic than reading and writing murder stories. She had considered these matters thoughtfully in the past, and had come to the conclusion that, in greater impulse, the the greater must be defense against the impulse, as it were to suffice as a social animal. She got up to change the angle of the Venetian blind, and Reginald, who had known her all his life, leered horribly and pinched her well-stuffed buttocks. Instantly, she went to the gales of merriment, her laughter resounding through the apartment. She poured him another cocktail, and when he had taken it, he wound up his facts quickly. Later, when the child had been taken to the hospital only to die there, the doctor, seeing her condition, asked for an autopsy, and that's where the arsenic was found. Again, Christine put her hands over her ears. She thought, I'm very vulnerable. I have no strength of character at all. She laughed nervously and said, Oh, please, please. Reginald laughed with her, patted her shoulder in sympathy, and said that in his opinion, this case was destined to become one of the classics of its kind. For one thing, there was thrifty reasoning of Nurse Dennison about payment of the last policy, a circumstance which gave dreadful to the affair of the whole some ordinary note it needed. For another, there was one of those unconsciously humorous asides which seemed to distinguish the classic from the lesser crime. For after which the autopsy, when her guilt had been established and confessed, Nurse Dennison, in a moment of contrition, said that she regretted the poisoning of her niece far more than she could ever say. She wept and said that she would never have done such a terrible thing either if she had known in advance such a little itty-bitty old pinch of arsenic could be found later. At 2:30, when lunch had been eaten, Reginald said he had to go, and while the women straightened up the kitchen, Emery turned on the radio to get the 3 o'clock news. The commentator spoke briskly of the word conditions for a time, and then lowering his voice, he continued gravely. I have been asked to announce that one of the children on the annual outing of the Fern Grammar School was accidentally drowned in the bay this afternoon. The name of the victim has been withheld until the parents are first notified. More news of this tragic affair is expected momentarily. Mrs. Breedlove and Christine came to the living room at once and stood anxiously beside the radio. It was not Rhoda, said Mrs. Breedlove in a positive voice. Rhoda is too self-reliant a child. She put her arm around Christine's waist and continued. It was somebody more like myself when I was a child. It was some timid, confused child who was afraid of his own shadow, as I was, and had no confidence at all. This does not sound like Rhoda. A little while later, toward the end of the broadcast, the announcer returned to the local tragedy. He was now authorized to say the little victim was Claude Daigle, the only child of Mr. and Mrs. Dwight Daigle of 126 Willow Street. He added details to the story. There was an old wharf on the Fern property, a wharf which had not been used for a long time. It was a mystery how the little boy got on the wharf, for the children had been explicitly told not to go there, but apparently he had managed somehow, for his body had been found there. After the routine check of the lunch china showed him missing, wedged among the old pilings. The discovery had been made by one of the guards who had brought the body ashore and applied artificial respiration. One mysterious element of the affair was the fact that there were bruises on the forehead and hands of the boy. But these bruises, it was assumed, were caused by the body washing against the pilings. Christine said, Poor child, poor little boy. The announcer continued, Only a few days before, the little Daigle boy had won a gold medal at the closing exercises of the Fern School. He was wearing the medal when last seen, but when his body was discovered, the medal was not found. It was thought the medal had become detached in some manner from his shirt, but although the bottom was searched at the place, the medal has not been located. Christine went to her own apartment immediately. She hoped her child had seen neither the boy brought to shore nor the efforts of the guards to revive him. If a child was frightened or upset emotionally, she wanted to be there at the door to comfort her. Rhoda was not a sensitive child. Certainly she was not an imaginative one, but the inevitableness of death she felt, if knowledge came too suddenly without a proper preparation, could make an impression on even the calmest person. When Rhoda came in at length, she was as placid, as unruffled as she had been that morning. She entered so coolly, she asked for a glass of milk and a peanut butter sandwich with such unconcern that her mother wondered if she fully understood what happened. She asked a question in her gentlest, serene voice, and Rhoda said yes, she knew all about it. In fact, it was she who suggested that the guards looked among the pilings. She had been present when the body was taken from the water. She had seen it out on the lawn. Christine put her arms around the stolen child and said, "You must get these pictures right out of your mind. I don't want you to be frightened or bothered at all. These things happen, and we accept them." Rhoda, entering her mother's embrace, said in a surprised voice that she wasn't disturbed in the least. She had found the discovery exciting, and the efforts at recitation, since she had never seen such a thing before, had interested her greatly. Christine thought, "She's so cool, so impersonal at things that bother others." It was the thing she had never been able to understand. It was the thing she and Ken once smiled about and called it the Rhoda reaction between themselves. This time she felt uneasiness, a depression she could never define nor fit in any pattern of any reality she knew. Rhoda pulled away from her mother. She went into her room and began working on her jigsaw puzzle. Later, Christine came into the room and put on the sandwich and milk at the table. Her face was still puzzled. Her brows puckered a little. She said, "Just the same, it was an unfortunate scene to remember." She kissed the child on top of her forehead and continued, "I understand how you really feel, my darling." Rhoda moved a bit of her puzzle into its proper place on the board, looked up. She said in a surprised voice, "I don't know what you're talking about, Mother. I don't feel any way at all." Christine sighed and went back to the living room. She tried to read, but she could not concentrate. Then Rhoda, as if feeling dimly that she had somehow erred, had done something which, though incomprehensible to her, had strongly displeased her mother, abandoned her puzzle, and approached the chair where Christine was sitting. She smiled her charming, hesitant smile, her single dimple appearing suddenly. She rubbed her cheek against her mother in a calculated simulation of affection, laughed coquettishly, and moved away. "She's done something naughty," thought Christine. "Something very naughty indeed to make her go to such trouble to please me." It seemed to her that her child, as sensing, though for the first time, that some factor of body or spirit separated her from those around her, tried to conceal the difference by aping the values of others. But since there was nothing spontaneous in her heart to instruct her, she must instead consider, debate, experiment, and feel her way cautiously through the values and minds of her models. She approached her mother once more, made an eager sound with her mouth, and kissed Christine on the lips, a thing she had not voluntarily done for a long time. Then her eyes narrowed, her head back, as though for a final glance of affection, she said, "What will you give me if I give you a basket of kisses?" It was a game that the child had sometimes played with her father, and Christine, knowing the rules so well, feeling a rush of both tenderness and pity, took the little girl in her arms and gave this expected answer, "I'll give you a basket of hugs." Later on, when she was bored with her puzzle, Rhoda got out her skates and said she'd like to go to the park. Her mother said she could, and not long afterward, hearing Roy's scolding, illiterate voice, she went to her kitchen window. The man was saying, "How come you go skating and enjoying yourself and your poor little schoolmate's still damp from drowning in the bay? Looks to me like you'd be in the house crying your eyes out, either that or being in church burning a candle in a blue cup." Rhoda stared at the man, but she did not answer. She moved in the direction of the park and stood there fumbling at the heavy iron gates. But Leroy could not leave her alone. He followed her and said, "Ask me, and I say you don't even feel sorry about what happened to that little boy." Rhoda, surprised for a moment out of her perpetual calmness, swung her skates from side to side and said, "Why should I feel sorry? It was Claude Daigle that got drowned, not me." Leroy shook his head, smiled with wry appreciation, and walked away. It was now close to quitting time, and mechanically he began to do those small chores that were required of him before he left for the day. The child's words echoing the brain. He swept the courtyard, made sure the basement door was locked securely, and as he did so, he kept repeating to himself, mimicking the child's voice as best as he could, "Why should I feel sorry? It was Claude Daigle that got drowned, not me." That Rhoda was really something. That little Rhoda didn't care about nobody that lived, not even her good-looking mama. That Rhoda was a mean little girl, if you ever seen one. That little Rhoda was like him in a lot of ways. Nobody could put nothing over on her, and nobody could but nothing over on him either. That was sure. That was something you could bet on. He lived on General Jackson Street, a good 2 miles from where he worked, in an unpainted frame house with his wife Thelma and his 3 gaunt, whining children. The building was on a little lower than on the street, and when it rained, water stood drained in a shallow pool under the house. Against the porch, Thelma had made flower beds of beer bottles driven into the earth. The ground was too damp. There was too much shade from the big sycamore and flowering althea bush at the end of the porch, and nothing seemed to grow well. That night, before he had his supper, he sat on the porch with his wife, his feet resting on the rickety railing, and at once he began to tell about his wife about the death of Daigle boy. But Thelma slapped at mosquitoes, yawned, and said, "Don't bother to tell me about it. I heard it on the radio." Then, as those words had reminded her of something, as something was silenced, there was a thing she could not endure. She went inside and turned on the radio, selecting one of the dance programs she liked so well. When she returned on the porch, Leroy said, "Jesus Christ, can't you turn that thing down? Can't a man have quiet even in his own house?" "I like it that way," she said. "I'd like to hear the music loud." She was a big, dull woman with the empty face of a fat baby. And as she sat again in her rocking chair, she said petulantly, "Quit spitting on them petunias. It's hard enough to coax them up as high as they are now. If you got to spit, sit on the steps." He moved on the steps, grumbling a little, and as though he'd forgotten for a moment that his present audience was not one he could press with tales of injustice, he said, pick on me and belittle me like everyone else does. I'm used to it. I can take it. I know I'm nothing but a poor sharecropper." "Listen, Leroy," said Thelma patiently. "Don't try to tell them lies because I know better. You never was a sharecropper. You never even lived in the country like I did when I was a girl. Your papa wasn't any sharecropper either. Your papa was a longshoreman, and you know as well as I do. Your papa made good money doing it. Nobody went hungry or wanted for anything in your papa's house. It's a pity you didn't turn out like him." "I didn't have a chance," he said. "I didn't have a chance to accomplish nothing. You had chances. You've had plenty chances. You're lazy." She fanned herself languidly, pulling down the yoke of her dress, and then thrusting her legs against the banister, she went on to berate him for his laziness, his lying, his dirtiness, his unwillingness to play up to the people that could help him along, her voice carrying all over the radio. The way he acted, the way he insulted people, was about a silly way a man could act. No wonder he was always losing his job. For instance, she knew that some of the people at the floor bell knew that he was always belittling, and they wasn't no way at all like the way he said. That Mrs. Breedlove, for instance, was a real nice, jolly woman and a kind-hearted one. Maybe he started doing nice things for people instead of griping all the time. Maybe, Then in the middle of a sentence, she said quickly, as though bored with her own moral advice, "How about a can of beer before I start supper?" She got the beer and brought it to the porch. It was still not dark, and the children were playing a game in the backyard, a game that seemed to require a great deal of bickering and screaming. Their voices interfered with the music, and Thelma went out of the house and turned off the radio a little more. "Jesus Christ," said Leroy, drinking his beer. "Can a man get no quietness even at homes? If I catch them kids, I'll tan the tar out of them." "You won't catch them, though," said Thelma placidly. "Them kids run too fast." It was then that Leroy repeated Rhoda's remark about the death of the Daigle boy, and Thelma, laughing a little, threw her can high over the fence and into the street. She got up from her chair and pulled her dress down from her sweating buttocks and said, "I think that's a real cute thing to say." "That's a real mean little girl," said Leroy. "I've never seen a little girl like that in all my born days." He got out his pipe, lit it, and smoked in silence, thinking about how the other children who played in the park, them other ones that wasn't mean, were all afraid of him, just like he wanted them to be. He could make them run and jump out of the park if he barked at them loud enough. He could even make the little girls cry and run off to tell their mama was on him. though he had always got off so far being humble and saying it wasn't so, or that little girl had been acting ugly, like trampling down the flowers, or trying eating to scoop a goldfish in the lily pond. That little Rhoda Penmark, he couldn't make no impression at all, at least not so far. But give him time and he would. Give him a little time and he'd make her jump and run in like all the others. He'd chuck in anticipation of that pleasant day, and then defiantly he spat in his wife's flower garden again. Thelma, slapping the mosquitoes with her palmetto fan, said, "Your papa made good money all his life. Your papa was a good provider. That I can say for him and do gladly." "That little Rhoda Penmark is a mean little girl," said Leroy aloud. "One thing you can say for her is this: she don't blab nothing. Anything that happens between me and her." Listen to me," said Thelma. "You leave that little girl alone. You hear me, Leroy? You're going to get yourself in trouble if you don't quit messing around with those rich folks and their children. I'm telling you, you're going to get yourself in a mess of trouble." "I don't do nothing to her," said Leroy, "except maybe plague her a little and tease her a little." "I'm telling you," said Thelma. "I'm telling you right now." She got up from her chair, called her children, and went to the kitchen to start supper. But Leroy remained on the steps for a time, smoking his pipe and thinking about the little Penmark girl. He would have been surprised to know that, in a sense, he was in love. He would have been surprised to know that, in a sense, he was in love with the little girl, and that his persecution of her, his nagging concern with everything she said, was part of the perverse and frightened courtship. That night after dinner, Christine went to the Daigle home on Willow Street. Her purpose was not clear in her mind, as it was quite dark when she went up the steps. The sky was soft, dark blue, and only the earthly stars against the horizon. Mr. Daigle answered the bell. He was a larger image of his son. There were the same pale, blue-veined forehead, the same outthrust jaw and small puckered underlip. The hand he offered Christine was cold and damp. She gave her name and explained her mission. She wanted to offer her sympathy and asked if there was anything she could do, and he said in a voice that trembled in spite of himself, "Anyone who knew our son is welcomed in this house." Then, opening the door, he said, "You are the first to call. We are not people who entertain a great deal, and we have not made many friends." The living room had a depressing look of expensive bad taste. There were beads and bows of ribbon everywhere. Everything was wrong, she thought. The furniture, the colors, the painting, even the big oriental rug somehow offended. Mr. Daigle said, "You must excuse the looks of the place. We have just returned from the funeral home, wherever they've taken him. Everything is a little disarranged and lacks Mrs. Daigle's touch." Then, staying there beside his visitor in the hall, he said, "You must go and speak to my wife. Perhaps there's something you can say. Perhaps something in some way you can." He knocked on his wife's door, whispering, "Hortense, here's a visitor. It's only new Claude. Her little girl was his classmate and was with him at the picnic." He went away silently, and Mrs. Daigle sat up on the sofa where she had been resting. Her hair was disarranged, her eyes were red and swollen, her mind still a little drugged from the sedative she had been given. She said, "It's not true that Claude was timid and lacked confidence in himself, as some people have said. I'm not saying he was a pushy, aggressive boy, because that wasn't true either. What I mean was, he was a sensitive boy, an artistic child, really. I'd like to show you some of the flower drawings he did so beautifully, but I can't bear to look at them again so soon." She broke off and pressed her face in her pillow. Christine sat beside her and took Mrs. Daigle's plump, rigid hand in her own, pressing it in sympathy. "We were so close to each other. He said I was his sweetheart, and he would put his little arms around my neck and tell me every little thought he had." She paused, unable to go on, and said, "I don't see why they couldn't find the medal. I'm sure the men didn't look hard enough. It was the only thing he ever wanted in his life, and he valued it so much." Then, as though the loss of the medal were more terrible than the loss of her son, she wept without constraint, her face pale and bloated, her hair falling limply over her eyes. When she could speak again, she continued, "Somebody said the medal must have fallen off his shirt and sunk down in the sand, but I've told my husband I don't think so. I don't see how the medal could have possibly come off by itself. I pinned the medal onto myself, and the clasp was strong and tight." She wiped her face with a damp towel, and in silence Christine said, I know so well. The men simply didn't look hard enough, said Mrs. Daigle. They said they looked over and over, but I told them to go back and look again. There was such a wonderful bond between us. We were so close to each other. He said I was his only sweetheart and he was going to marry me when he grew up. He obeyed me completely. He wouldn't go into the corner until he discussed the matter with me, and I told him it was all right. He wanted to be buried with his medal. I know that without being told. I wanted to please him in every way I can. Will you tell the men to go look for the medal again? And that's the end of that chapter. Thanks for listening. Bye.